Yeah, I'm going to get started just because I don't want to run over to the next slot. So we're going to be joined by Daniel Squadron, who's a New York State Senator for Lower Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn. And I am Jesse Laymon. I'm the Downstate Campaigns Director for Citizen Action of New York, which is a progressive advocacy organization, for those of you that don't know. We're also board members of the Working Families Party. Come on in, join us.
Hi, I'm looking for rooms. I have a session, so.
Oh, okay, you're looking for yours. Good luck. So we are, Citizen Action is leading a coalition on campaign finance reform in 2011 and 2012. The sort of core members of our coalition are the Working Families Party, Common Cause New York, which is another good government and progressive advocacy group, the Brennan Center for Justice, which is really the policy and legal think tank behind this kind of reform and the experts on how it works. The Center for Working Families, which is another think tank. And then there's a variety of other groups that are less directly engaged in sort of the week-to-week, day-to-day management of the coalition, but that are signed on and that are supportive, including half dozen of the biggest unions in the state, almost every local community group that you can think of around the state, many of which are affiliated with either Citizen Action or the Working Families Party. And what the whole coalition exists to do is to actually enact a system of public financing of elections for New York State in the coming year, which is a big lift, and we're going to talk about that, but it's also really necessary, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'll let, when he comes, Senator Squadron talk a little bit about his thoughts on why we need reform in general in electoral politics, what's wrong with the current system. And I'm also going to let him, and maybe you guys might have some questions along these lines, talk about some of the other reforms worth pursuing. There's no one reform in electoral politics is going to be a magic bullet and solve all of our problems, right? There's a whole bunch of things that are kind of messy in the current system, whether it's redistricting, which we were just chatting about, or the ability for outside groups to do big money outside expenditures. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. Those things are good. We support those things. But I'm going to focus on how candidates finance their campaigns, how the system is messed up right now, and what we can realistically do to fix it. So this is actually a point, first couple points, that I think is actually one of the most interesting and thought-provoking parts of any discussion of campaign finance. Because by show of hands in this large, crowded, exciting room, how many of you have heard a phrase like, we've got to get the money out of politics? Yeah, right. Or, there's too much big money in politics, things like that, right? These are concepts which come from absolutely the right sentiment. There's a very sort of well-meaning and intelligent direction to those ideas. But it's actually a little bit off in its assessment of what the problem specifically is. Campaigns are kind of expensive. New York State has some of the most expensive campaigns in the country for state-level races, but that's very relative. We're talking about the fact that a lot of states, frankly, get by on democracy for pennies. The reality is campaigns, writ large in America, are not really that expensive when you consider that this is a country of 310 million people and that democracy is kind of sort of important. So, for example, a couple of my favorite statistics along these lines, Americans spend more money in 1 year on pet food than we do in a 4-year cycle on all races for federal office, independent and direct expenditures by candidates. So if you add up all the money by all the candidates that ran for president and Senate and Congress and all the groups that spent on their behalf, the RNC and the DNC and all of that, it's about a quarter as much as was spent on pet food over that same 4-year period. Other things that we spend more on than democracy in this country, women's facial cosmetics, just the facial stuff. We wouldn't want to go crazy. We apparently value that more than campaigns in this country as well. So the issue isn't really that huge amounts of money are being spent on campaigns. As a percentage of the budgets of the governments that these people then get to run after they're elected, usually the elections themselves run something like 1/1000th or 1/3000th or 1/5000th of the annual budget that these guys are then going to get to manage after having gotten elected. So that's not a terrible investment, if you want to look at it that way, from, say, the perspective of the donors. Welcome. Come on in. You can have a seat. I actually just was introducing you and was going to let you talk a little bit too. I'm Jesse Laymon.
Yeah,
Squadron. Nice to see you. This is for some of you, your state senator. Let me just back up a second because I want to make sure I tell you what I said that you might be talking about, and then whenever there's a chance, you can jump in and talk about it. So I just wanted at some point to let you talk about why we need reform. And then I'm really focusing on public financing of elections and both the policy aspects of it and also the political aspects of it. There's other things that we could do to reform our elections in this state as well, and I thought you might want to touch on some of those. I had been told you might have to bail at some point.
I do, unfortunately. Yeah,
okay.
Unfortunately.
So,
I typed both the beginning and end, which I apologize.
That's fine. So I wanted to sort of let you go near the beginning to talk about that.
Great.
I can pick back up talking about public financing after you if you want to.
Great.
If you're ready, you want to just dive in.
Excellent. Thank you.
No
Thank
problem.
you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Thank all of you for being here. It's good to see. How many of you live in Lower Manhattan or parts of Brooklyn? Where in Brooklyn?
No, I'm in Park Slope.
Wrong side. I call it the wrong side of Brooklyn. Where do you live? That too. Anything out of my district? No. I lived in Park Slope for a long time after college, so on Fifth Avenue. And you guys don't live in either Brooklyn or Manhattan, so you're.
I live in Connecticut, so I'm way out.
Wow, look at that. We're in Connecticut.
We have public finance.
You do, yeah.
We're in Connecticut. I don't know why you need to come. You should be going and working on a pretty effective state government. Where in Connecticut?
New Haven.
How about yourself?
New Jersey.
New Jersey. Wow, look at that. It's a full tri-state group. We are represented by 3 states in this room. It's a large and diverse group. So I actually wanted to talk about not so much what form of campaign finance reform we need, because Jess is going to do a great job with that. Or really, frankly, why it makes a difference, because I don't think you would be here if you didn't know that it makes a difference. And I also think Jesse's going to make that case pretty significantly. But I want to talk about two things. One is just how important it is in the context of state government, and 2, sort of how to make it happen and why it's so difficult to make it happen. The first is, when I ran for office, I ran against a 30-year incumbent in a state where it's almost impossible to be one unless there's a scandal. You're still in New York State more likely to be indicted or die in office than you are to lose a competitive election. And in fact, after I won against the incumbent, a reporter told me that he thought that in his memory, and this was sort of an old Albany reporter, if you were to exclude incumbents who were under a reported investigation or under indictment, or who had switched parties, elected as one party and then switched once they were there for power reasons, or who had just won in a special election, basically had never stood for election before, if you took out those basically 3 categories, right? Those under indictment, those who are party switchers, and those who have basically never been elected, he only knew of one other case, period, in which the incumbent had lost. So that essentially means that competitiveness in New York State is almost non-existent. It occurs in very, very rare instances, and in those instances it's almost always based on some predictable external factor having to do with the democratic process really getting poisoned. I talked a lot about reform when I ran, and it was very important to me. And I talked about a number of different reforms. I talked about ethics reform, I talked about redistricting reform, I talked about rules reform, and I talked about campaign finance reform. The truth is all 4 are really important. And I was able to get a lot of traction in my first term on ethics reform. It's something the reporters love, newspapers love it, because it's about beating up elected officials who are taking advantage of the system. And it is in fact about that, but that also makes it a good story. It's more oppositional than some. Redistricting reform is critical. It really is the difference between elected officials choosing their voters and voters choosing their elected officials. Rules reform is eye-crossingly boring for most people. I could probably find a room somewhere today that's interested in it, but it's really hard to get folks focused on it. It's the parliamentary procedure of the legislative body. Actually really important, and probably arguably the second most important of the 4 kinds of reform I talked about. But I have realized in 3 years in office that the most fundamental reform is campaign finance reform. A lot of the ethics problems you have stem from a poison campaign finance system. The ability to have rules that create a legislative process that's absolutely non-democratic and often totally dysfunctional is largely based on the fact that you don't have folks who feel like they're involved in the system. Campaign finance reform doesn't solve that, but it deals with that. It manages that. And redistricting reform is important for competitiveness in elections. But the truth is, between campaign finance reform and redistricting reform, if you can only get one, campaign finance reform does more for competitiveness than redistricting reform. They're both very important. So of the four, campaign and finance reform is the one that's sort of the fundamental building block of a democratic process. And it's almost impossible to build a truly functional democracy with the kind of campaign finance reform we have in New York State. I can't speak to New Jersey. I know a little bit about what Connecticut has, and I know we have in New York City, and you see it again and again. That you don't have perfect democracies. You don't have suddenly a platonic democracy, but you do have a number of features in democracies that have decent campaign finance systems, public financing of elections that you don't have otherwise. And so, it's the funny thing is, as I alluded to, you can get a huge amount of focus on ethics reform. Ethics reform is really like, which criminal elected official goes to jail. You can get a lot of focus and conversation about that, and that's good, and we pushed for that because there was a moment when we could, and it was important. Redistricting reform is hard to get focus on because it's so detailed, but this is a once in every 10 years event. A once every 10 years event you can get some focus on because it's once every 10 years. Rules reform is actually interesting. Though it's eye-crossingly boring in substance, you can create floor debates over it, so you can actually get into conflict on the floor because that's the place that you talk about rules, and that's something you can get people to focus on. Just as campaign finance reform is really the most important or the most fundamental of those four reforms, it is also the most difficult to get the world excited about. The world meaning mainstream media, the world meaning sort of folks on the ground to come up to you. I got to tell you, you can get folks on the ground excited about government. Remember when those of you who are New Yorkers, remember when the state Senate had a coup in 2009 and was dysfunctional, it didn't function, non-functional for 35 days? People were coming up to me on the street. I had like state senators don't normally get recognized that much on the street. People coming up to me on the street saying, "What's wrong with you? Fix it." That got people engaged in state government on the negative side. Hydrofracking, the discussion about hydrofracking. I can't tell you. I'm surprised the extent to which people come up to me on the street to talk about hydrofracking. So it is possible to get people excited about state government. It's even possible, around the coup, people were talking about ethics reform or connecting on it. It's very, very, very difficult in campaign finance reform. So some people will tell you that difficulty and that challenge is the reason that we haven't gotten traction on making campaign finance reform in the state. A combination of lowering the just absurd limits that you're going to talk about, of creating a system of public financing, public matching, which we have in New York City, which you're going to talk about. Sort of all of the different ways that, if I was able to say, which I would like to do, I would get into the details of, minute details of. But that's not actually the reason that you can't get campaign finance reform. Because the truth is there are some folks who really want to make it happen, right? A lot of them are here today. A lot of the good government groups, I think, understand. They may not say it in the newspapers because they're trying to get their moment of opportunity on whatever reform issue is of the moment. But the truth is they get how fundamental this is and really believe in it. So, it's a really interesting thing. And I think a lot of times we spend in the progressive movement and the reform movement, spend a lot of time lamenting the fact that the most important reform or the most important policy change is not one that you can get made because people aren't interested, because you can't get the newspapers to write about it. It's better and easier when you can, and that's always one path to do something. But that's not actually, at this point, after 3 years, not actually why you can't make campaign finance happen in the state, campaign finance reform happen in the state, in my view. The basic reason is because the way to assess whether something's going to happen in Albany is you have to look who is opposed to this, who is going to be hurt. It's the negative frame, not who is going to help, who wants this, who's going to be opposed, who is this going to hurt. And if you look at that question, there are sort of two possible answers. And again, I think we need to be careful not to focus on the first of the two, because the second is more important. The first is incumbent elected officials, right? The truth is, think those of us who know about campaign finance reform first know it doesn't actually hurt incumbents necessarily. And the second is, to the extent it does hurt any incumbents, it helps an equal number, or not equal number, it helps a significant number too. Campaign finance reform is good for incumbents who are doing a good job. Because as an incumbent, it's easier to prove you're doing a good job than as a challenger. So if you are doing a good job and are engaging in your district, are engaging on the grassroots, then under a system of cap spending, under a system of smaller contributions, you do real well, actually. As an incumbent who doesn't do that, you don't do well. But the truth is, you don't have sort of a huge movement of folks with pitchforks who are incumbent elected officials who don't want campaign finance reform. You have some who don't want it, and they tend to be the ones who benefit from this current system, just like anyone who opposes change in any moment. Those who support change do less well in the current system. Those who oppose it do better in the current system. But that's not the fundamental reason we don't have it. Because again, you have enough elected officials who either do a good job or believe they do a good job that they're okay with campaign finance reform. The big issue is you have a small number of large moneyed interests who use this as their way to control the system. So the only story that I think sort of matters, the only way to understand this issue is one, and I've changed the name of the bill and the name of the senator I'm dealing with, but this has happened to me more in the majority than the minority, because in the minority you don't pass bills just because it's a horribly partisan place. But in the majority, again and again, I had good bills I wanted to pass, and here's how it went down. Remember, there's 32 Democrats, Republicans are voting against everything, period. So you kind of got to get all 32. There's a lot of bills that are good, and in my view, don't hurt anyone, right? So I say a bill to make all ball bearings in New York State safer at no cost to the industry, right? That was a bill I carried in 2010, let's say. So I carry the bill, I worked with the leadership, I worked with the central staff, I worked with the assembly so that we really know this is a good bill. In fact, I even talked to the industry a little bit to make sure we're not missing something about the ball bearing industry that's going to drive it out of New York. And in fact, this is a bill that's not going to hurt New York businesses at all. It's going to change the market in New York a little bit, but it will change the market both for ball bearing companies based in Brooklyn and for ball bearing companies based in New Haven or Short Hills. Great bill. I start to move it. The floor council comes up to me and says, you don't have 32 votes. Senator Albany is against your ball bearing safety bill. So, okay, I haven't heard from Senator Albany on this. I've been talking about, we're going to talk to Senator Albany. So I go up to Senator Albany in the lounge, having a fresca, which you get in the lounge as a state senator, probably the best perk of the job, frankly. And I say, hey, I hear you have a problem with my bill. Senator Albany says, oh, yeah, I don't. But have you spoken to lobbyist X of the ball bearing industry? I say, yeah, I thought I had. I said, yeah, lobbyist X told me it's not a good bill. I say, well, what's the problem? Let's talk about it. I've really been working on this bill. I don't know. Talk to lobbyist X. Okay, sure, I'll do that. So I go talk to lobbyist X of the ball bearing industry. We talk through things. It turns out that lobbyist X is actually looking for something to put New York companies in a better position than every other company, even though it makes ball bearings less safe than the bill would otherwise do. We work through it, we push, we prod. Eventually, lobbyist X says, you know what, I'm not going to support it, but I'm not going to oppose it. Right? Then I go back to Senator Albany the next day, and I say, hey, I think the bill's better. Senator Albany says, okay, let me check. I say, well, I'll describe it. Let me check. I see Senator Albany and lobbyist X talking out in the lobby, where the lobbyists are confined. Comes back to me and says, no, you're right. I can't be the 32nd vote. I say, what do you mean? Well, lobbyist X doesn't oppose it, but they don't support it. I can't be the 32nd vote. If you get a 33rd, then, So at which point I then basically have to get 3 or 4 Republicans to sort of inadvertently, hey, this is going to pass anyway. It makes sense to vote for it, so that I can get it to the floor. That bill, actually, the actual bill, which was not about ball bearings, but something else, but also something very important, something that has to do with child health and other issues, did not end up passing. Here's the fundamental piece of that. Senator Albany is barely a senator, because Senator Albany is willing to take their own prerogative as an elected official and completely outsource it to lobbyist X. Lobbyist X, not actually unreasonable considering the fact it's an industry lobbyist. A bit of a pain, certainly not interested in the common good, but doing their job in a system where they should be allowed to do their job. The ball bearing industry exists in New York. They have jobs. They should have a lobbyist. That lobbyist should be able to push us. That lobbyist should under no circumstances control the vote lock stock of an elected official. The only reason that happens is either that lobbyist or the industry that lobbyist works for has enough money that this senator doesn't think it's worth it to engage themselves. In a system where you have a decent campaign finance rules, you might have Senator Albany say, I've got a ball bearing factory in my district. I'm real worried about it. You might have Senator Albany say, look, I've got a relationship with this lobbyist. We've worked well in the past. I know they're reasonable, and I don't think you're giving them a fair hearing. You will never have a senator say, I don't know, it's up to them. Because it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense in a system where that lobbyist is so valuable to this senator that this senator is going to walk away from their moral, their constitutional obligation. So, in terms of why we need this, and in terms of why it's going to be very, very hard, it is about convincing lobbyist X, not Senator Albany, or marginalizing Senator Albany. But the real thing to do here, you got to figure out how to get lobbyist X out of that conversation. And it's very difficult, and I don't know how to do it. It has happened in New York City. It has happened in other places. The truth is some of these industries at some point get tired of having to spend the money they have to spend to own elected officials. But in terms of organizing around making the substance that you're going to talk about in much greater detail here, that is the conversation, that is the issue, that is the challenge, and the wall that we need to knock down. And as a state senator, as the elected official, we almost never add a great deal to the conversation about detailed substance. We almost never add a great deal to the conversation about why something's important or not. Again, if you're already listening to the conversation, you know. The thing I thought I could most add was that experience at the Billapalooza period when you pass hundreds of bills in a few days, and why it's so hard to do good things because of the campaign finance system. So I'm going to take a couple questions.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Great, thank you.
And that was perfect, by the way. Anybody have questions for Senator Squadron?
You can also ask, what's New York State? We are now outnumbered by New Yorkers.
So how do we bring to public attention some of the specifics to get pressure on some of the specific senators who are Senator Lobby? How do we start to get pressure on them so they think it's more worth their while to vote for campaign finance reform than to placate the lobby?
I actually, there's two ways, right? So the fear of not being elected drives most elected officials most of the time, right? So if you could, right? So each of the things that I said is not the reason this doesn't happen. If you could change each of those, this would happen. If you could make enough public pressure, both on the grassroots and in the media, Senator Albany would change, because Senator Albany is not going to give up their job for lobbyist X. In fact, the reason they care about lobbyist X is to keep their job, right? So if you could change the conversation in the media or in the grassroots in a broad-based way, to the point that the senator is concerned about losing their job. That's the first way. The second way is you convince Senator Albany that lobbyist X is not the friend they want, and that this person is engaged enough and focused enough, they actually want a system that's more diffuse and less concentrated. And then the third is you somehow convince lobbyist X that the system right now overall doesn't make sense for them, and a functional government is better than a dysfunctional government.
Let me take it down. Can I just
By the way, if I knew the answer to how to do any of those three, I would be outdoing them right now and for 24 hours a day.
How do we come up with a list of which senator is the tame pet of which lobby, so that we can set up a matrix of the lobbyists and their tame senators?
So luckily, Albany is actually not that complicated because it's so partisan. You really have two conferences for most intents and purposes. The Democrats being in the majority was sort of an exception to that rule in a way that was both frustrating and dysfunctional, also actually democratic and engaged in some ways at some moments. But the truth is, right now we know who Senator Albany is in the current context, and that is the Senate Republican conference that's in the majority, controls what bills come to the floor. So the matrix is those who control bills that come to the floor. The way, despite some decent rules reforms, the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate leadership control what bills come to the floor. That's the only matrix that matters right now. This is something that if it got a vote, would pass. Because voting against it risks that first question, right? That question of potentially losing your job. Some folks will still vote against it, but enough will vote for it if it gets a vote. The challenge is the vote. Very simple. Which senators matter for the vote? The leadership of the majority conference. That's how Albany works. There's no other way to get the bills to the floor in practice, sadly.
We'll take Josh and then I'll...
Given the small d democratic tendencies of the governor, how does he factor into this conversation?
So there's a sort of a, that's like the wild card, right? So there's it's talking about a matrix, right? There's a matrix and some rules and stuff. The governor is almost a factor outside of that normal matrix because he has proven, I don't know if he can change the physics of Albany or bend the physics to his will, but in either case, he has proven extraordinarily effective. And sort of, you can always say, okay, here's how things happen in Albany, here's how you stop them, you have a rule, it's a nice political science conversation. You could probably fit what the governor's done into that conversation, but the truth is it actually is outside of that conversation. He has come in and basically, by force of will, being a popular governor who understands the system extraordinarily well, gotten things done that you would not predict could be done based on the original matrix.
He capitalizes on the three men in the room.
It's really not. That would be its own other symposium. Why is this governor in his first year been so effective at knocking down the pins he wants to knock down? It's not just that he understands three men in a room and operates in it when necessary. That's part of it. There's a lot else to it. So the truth is, the governor has been supportive of campaign finance reform. The governor was clear that ethics reform was the first thing that had to happen. Truth is, we had been pushing for ethics reform for 2 years. It had almost happened. It had been vetoed. That makes sense. Redistricting reform is on the plate right now. Rules reform is not something a governor is going to engage in ever. It's really a legislative issue. So the hope is that the governor will have both sort of the bandwidth and the choice and choose to focus on campaign finance reform in that way, the way that ethics reform is focused on. It isn't going to guarantee it, because the physics of Albany are still the physics of Albany. That would be a great, huge thing. He's been really good on the issue. He's been really clear where he is on the issue. The truth is, there's a finite number of things, even if you're this governor being as effective as this governor's been, that you can make happen. If this were one of the things, that would be great. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was terrific.
I'm sorry to be in and out, but good to see all of you.
Look at that. A state senator who knows what he's doing, ladies and gentlemen.
There you go. That's how I see it. See it, Jesse. I got it.
That was great, and I actually think I will try and circle back around some of the things that Senator Squadron brought up about how we get it done, and his explanation of the ways that you get a reform like this to happen are almost exactly our understanding of what our coalition needs to do to get it done. I'm going to try and blast through since we've got about 15 minutes on the schedule. Now, everything started about 20 minutes late, so I'm sort of suspecting and hoping the 11 o'clocks will all start late. But I'll try and finish my bit by 11. So if you guys feel at that point you have to run, you can run, but then I'll stay and take questions past 11. So I had been just before Senator Squadron arrived talking about how the problem isn't the raw amount of money in politics. So then what is the money problem? If it's not the raw amount that's so corrupting and so screwed up and that leads to the effect that Senator Squadron was talking about with senators and not just state senators, but other elected officials being effectively controlled by some of their donors. Well, the problem is twofold, and it's that the money, however much of it there is coming from such a tiny group of people, a small donor class. And then secondarily, that it's going to a tiny group of people, the people that they consider viable, which are mostly the already elected incumbents. On that first point, and this is just, I think, a shocking statistic, for all elections in New York State, governor, state senate, assembly, whatever you name it, less than 0.5% of all voting age New Yorkers are contributing in a 4-year cycle to anybody. So, for those of us that occasionally in our lives have been really concerned about things like voter turnout, well, that's a big deal, and we feel good if we get that over 50, maybe over 60, maybe 70%. But we're at 1/2 of 1% of what I call donor turnout. And if donors have the kind of sway that Senator Squadron was just talking about them having, that's a big problem, because that's a tiny segment of our population that has that sway. And what that means, if you think about the basic underlying math there, is that in order to finance those campaigns from a tiny group of people, the checks that they're writing have to be really large. So New York State, roughly 80% of all the donations, all the money in the last election cycle, came from what we classify as large donors. Those are checks of over $1,000, and from non-party groups. That basically means PACs, most of which are corporate PACs. Business groups dominated the fundraising for party committees as well. So even if your campaign was largely supported by your party, the state Democratic Senate committee funded a lot of your state Senate campaign, that's still basically the same business groups funding your campaign, because they're the ones that are dominating the giving to the state Senate Democratic committee. So no matter which way you slice it, there's this tiny group of people at the end of the chain that controls all the money that are giving it to the campaigns. Part of the reason this is so bad is that our state has arguably some of the worst laws in the country in terms of state campaign finance. There are, to be fair, about a dozen states, mostly in the Deep South, that have literally no laws about campaign finance. But if you ignore them, we have the highest donation limits of any state with a limit. We allow direct corporate donations to candidates, which a lot of states don't. And we allow corporations and rich folks to skirt even those already high limits by setting up shell corporations, fake LLCs, and things like that. And as many different corporate entities as they can invent and name, each of those can give the maximum contribution to a candidate for state office. The senator talked a little bit about some of the scandals and the fact that in this state we do have a tendency of people to leave office under indictment or in handcuffs. And this is the point that actually I really was glad that Senator Squadron sort of touched on, which is that we should get a good understanding of who's winning in the current system today. And it's not the candidates, right? It's not like we should feel bad about the people, oh, look at them, they're raising so much money. It's the donors, right? It's this tiny group of rich donors that are really the ones that are getting the most out of the status quo. And they're dominating us. They're killing the regular guys who can, maybe I like Dan Squadron a lot. Maybe I'll write him a $200 check. That's probably about the most I could afford, right? But that's just not going to matter, because a millionaire giving the maximum contribution of, it'll be $10,000+ in the next election cycle, is just going to make my $200 look like pennies, chump change, and irrelevant. They can give 40 or 50 times as much as the regular folks. We're not winning. We are almost literally worthless. And this is the point I was just making, that it's not the candidates who really are winning. And in fact, because Senator Albany, right, in the example, is so reliant on lobbyist X that he sort of has to do lobbyist X's bidding. Now that means that he's losing some of the power that maybe he could have if he were a state senator in a real way. Not even kind of moderately rich people are doing well in the current system. You can give $1,000, you're still pretty much irrelevant. You got to write those huge checks in order to matter. It's really only millionaires and big corporations that are winning right now. So I had talked about this a little bit about the money coming from big donors only. There's a couple. One of my favorite sort of random little statistics. There were 18 individual people in New York State that in the last election cycle gave over $150,000 to New York candidates. I think 10 of the 18 are literally billionaires. Those are the people that are actually winning in the current system. For some of these stats, I want to also give a citation. Professor Michael Malvin at the Campaign Finance Institute was really helpful in pulling some of this together. This is where the money comes. It's just an incredible bar graph. Where the money comes from right now in New York State legislative offices. So this is just Assembly and Senate. If you can't see, that's 2% of all the money raised by candidates is coming from contributions of up to $100. In fact, if you add up contributions of up to $1,000, that's 13%. So 87% of contributions for legislative candidates are coming from gifts of over $1,000 from individuals, party donations, which means at the end of the day, corporate PACs that are funding the party, and corporate PACs, right? 87% is coming from huge, big chunk checks. That's where the money is coming from right now under the status quo system. That's the problem. It's not the raw amount of money, it's that graph. That is what's screwing our democracy. And a nice little example, I am allowed to use real names of people and corporations. Verizon, between, I think it was the 2008 and 2010 election cycles, decided to really get involved and spent $1.2 million on donations to candidates for various state offices. That was a good investment for Verizon, because they got a $614 million subsidy from the state for a new facility in Western New York after funding a whole bunch of candidates. I'm sure it's a coincidence, but State Senator George Maziarz received the maximum from them in both election cycles and then happened to sponsor the bill that gave them their $614 million subsidy. I'm sure it had nothing to do with that. But this is how it works. This is how Lobby X controls Senator Albany. So what can we do about it? We do have a really good example of a system that works much better. And it works very well in New York City Council races especially. And it is something that can pass in Albany, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And it's also something that can really fundamentally change that horrifying bar graph that I showed you a minute ago. In New York City Council, we have a system where campaigns are funded largely through public money. It's through a matching fund system. So under these sorts of systems, candidates have to opt in, and by opting in, they voluntarily accept much lower limits on the gifts they can accept. No more $10,000 checks, no more big PAC contributions, no contributions from corporations at all, in fact. They have to accept something, maybe it's $2,000, the limits vary in different states, different municipalities that do this, but a lower limit and limits on who can give to them. And in exchange, the first little bit of money in each contribution, sometimes it's the first 100, sometimes the first 200, numbers in that range. In New York City, it's 175 right now, is matched by public money at a leveraged rate. 4-to-1, 6-to-1, 8-to-1, something like that. So there's for example, you could have gifts of below 250 matched 6-to-1 by public money. This changes two things. One is that it makes your small donation, my $200 that I could give the dance squad, that's not a promise. You could call me later and ask for $200. I like them a lot, but you have to twist my arm. My $200, if I wanted to give it to Dance Squadron, it might actually make a difference because it's matched 6-to-1. Now that's $1,400 for him. Hey, that's money he can really use. So it makes me matter more. It makes small donors matter more. It also, and I don't know if I made this a bullet point. I didn't. It also changes the incentives for the candidates and their fundraisers, right? If you know that your first $200 or first $250 of each contribution that you raise is going to get matched 6-to-1, it changes how you want to fundraise. Instead of just going after the big fish who can write $10,000 checks, now your incentive is, I need to get 20 people in a room and get them to each give me $100, because that's going to get multiplied 6 times out, and oh my God, that's thousands and thousands of dollars. So it changes your mentality as a candidate, as a campaign staffer, in a way that even more than just the matching of the first couple $100 dramatically changes where the money ends up coming from in funding your campaigns. And this is where the money would end up coming from. This is, again, from Michael Malvin of the Campaign Finance Institute. This is just taking existing New York State races, using sort of last year's data, and doing two things. One is applying a 6-to-1 match on contributions of, or actually, it's a 5-to-1 match in this virtual model on contributions of under $250. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, based on other municipalities that have had matching fund systems, tweaking the percentage of the population that is donating to candidates. It's not a huge tweak. It's like from half of 1% to like 1.5% or something like that. But those two little mathematical functions would mean that in the next election cycle, if we had this in place, 49%, roughly half, of all the money that all the candidates would raise for state legislative office would be coming from those checks of under $100. And in fact, the majority, the solid majority, it's like 65% or so, would come from contributions of under $1,000. Just a radical, shocking difference from the way it is now. That is, to me, the most powerful and awe-inspiring graph.
Does that include the matching funds?
Yes. Yes. So part of the reason that the big graph here is that the actual money from the individuals is maybe that slice, and then the 6-to-1 match is that slice, right? But it's the combination of that match with the change in incentives for donors and for fundraisers that makes the small donors dominate the system in a public matching fund system. So, in fact, this is not just imaginary. This is not just projections on some computer. We can take the obvious example. Because we're in New York City, which is also in New York State, you can compare the same population, which is represented at two different levels, one of which has a public matching fund and one of which doesn't, and look at how we behave. So, as I said before, only 7% of the money, if you just limit it to $250 or less, came from the donations of $250 or less at the state level in the last election cycle. In the same geographic area with the same constituents, 65% of the money for city council races came from those same donors of $250 or less. And the donor participation more than tripled from less than half of 1% to closer to 2%. Those are the same people. This is not some imaginary world. This is really New York City versus really New York State. And just the only difference is that the law is better in New York City. So it works. I'm just going to power through. Good candidates win now. As Senator Squadron was saying, if you're a good incumbent or a good challenger, it's much easier to convince people to give you a little bit of money, and the money actually matters. And we win because the candidates seek our support. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how we make it happen, and then I want to let you guys go to the next thing because it's 11 right now. The things that Senator Squadron said are absolutely right in terms of making it happen. The most direct, the fastest, and most powerful way that we could win this in 2012, and it's a definite possibility, is that Governor Cuomo puts it high on his agenda. He's always been in support, as Dan said, but support is not enough. As he pointed out, there's really only 4 or 5 things that get heavily debated and fought over in Albany each year. It's there's a limited bandwidth to any discussion in Albany. The governor controls that bandwidth to a large extent. If he, in his State of the State address in a little over 2 weeks, comes out and says, my priorities for 2012 are as follows. Blah, 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 and public financing of elections. We have a real chance. Just him saying that. Him putting it out there and saying, this is one of the 3 or 4 things that I want to see happen in 2012. Because, as the senator noted, if this were to come to a vote in either house of our state legislature, it would probably pass. Because voting against reform is usually not good for your health as a politician, right? But the state senate especially is likely to not bring it up for a vote if they can avoid it. And if nobody's talking about it, if the governor especially isn't talking about it, maybe they avoid it. So the first, best, most powerful way that we can make this happen is if the governor comes out and says, this is one of my priorities. And I can tell you there's, I'd say better than 50-50, probably a 60-40 chance that in the State of the State address, this is going to be one of the things that the governor prioritizes. That's not 100%. It might not happen. If you happen to run into Andrew Cuomo on the street next week, make sure to say, hey, governor, you should really talk about public financing in your State of the State address. We do have some hope in that the Assembly is really on our side. The Assembly leadership is on our side, and there are some really, really committed champions lower down in the Assembly who want to see this happen and who, no matter what, governor or not, are going to bring the bill up and are going to probably pass a bill in 2012. But in order to get it through the Senate, we're going to have to fight in some tough districts, and we're going to have to try and make it an issue for some incumbents to say, where are you on this issue, and make it something that could electorally threaten them if they ignore us or don't vote for it. And that's going to take community support. That's going to take the coalition partners that I talked about at the very beginning. I can talk more about strategy and stuff, but it is just past 11, and I promise to sort of let people ask me questions at this point. So I'm going to do that. There is the model, there is the vision, there is why we need it and what we can do to get it to happen. But I'm sure there are things I didn't touch on that people are interested in. So feel free to ask questions. Yeah.
So one of the issues we're dealing with in Connecticut now, and one of the hot issues in campaign finance now is the trigger provision for dealing with situations where you can self-finance a candidate. What do you think is the solution to that problem?
I think so. Connecticut is one of a couple of states, for those that don't know, that has a system of public financing of elections right now. Their system's a little different from what I described. It's sort of it's actually traditional in a certain sense, in that this was sort of really in vogue some years back, the real true clean money system, where candidates qualify for a block grant of money to run their campaign by collecting
and grants.
Right, but they do have to raise a little bit of money, but it's in very small contributions. It's like $5 contributions or something like that. And then they get a chunk of, I think it's $30,000 to run for state assembly. I don't know what it is for the Senate level. Yeah. That's the trigger provision, which is something that a lot of states that have that kind of system have, is where if you're outspent by another candidate who's not, who has not opted into the clean money system, you get additional money to compete with them. Are brilliant. They could never be wrong. They're clearly never ever biased. 5 conservative members of the Supreme Court have decided that is unconstitutional because giving people money to run their campaigns and get their message out somehow diminishes the free speech rights of the millionaire who's running against them. They are the Supreme Court, so there's not a whole lot we can do about them. But what we can do is try to manufacture the systems in such a way so that the now unconstitutional triggers are not as essential to the system functioning well. Probably what that means is allowing additional matching funds for anyone that feels the need to raise it. So it can't be contingent on you're getting outspent by somebody, but a pool of matching funds that is a bit larger than what it is in Connecticut now, that allows candidates to keep raising the small contributions and keep getting matched so that they're able to keep up to some degree with outside candidates. The other thing that'll almost certainly have to happen, and that New York City will almost certainly do, is in some of these systems there's also a maximum limit on how much money can total be raised and spent by the candidates that have opted in. Obviously the candidates that haven't opted in aren't subject to that limit and have that big disproportionate advantage. That limit will probably have to go away. So there'll always be a limit on how much public money you can get, because state budgets, are tight and they don't want to give an unlimited amount of money to candidates. But you can keep raising very small contributions beyond the state money in a way that allows you to keep up. I do want to also say that there's one sort of positive, I think, what's the word? Hopeful fact that I saw from actually the folks at the Campaign Finance Institute recently that gives hope that sort of situation is not actually as dire as it seems. And that is that the data is really interesting and starting to come in on this, that for every level of elected office, there is an unspoken but nevertheless clear in the data point of diminishing marginal returns on campaign expenditures. A point beyond which you can keep spending more money, but it actually does not in any way increase the likelihood of you winning the race. And this has been most clearly found in congressional races, where that point is almost exactly around $1 million. So that is to say, in a race between two candidates, as long as up to the point where one of them has or where they both have $1 million, the one with more money almost always wins, or wins a certain defined percentage of the time. once they both have more than $1 million to run their campaign, the relationship between who has more money and who wins disappears. So
we call it the Lyndon McMahon effect.
right, and in California they call it the Meg Whitman effect, right? It's the same thing. There's a point at which you get to diminishing returns, and that exists at every level, and the number is different at different levels. So the best public financing systems don't have to get the good guys to actually have as much money as the bad guys. They just have to make sure the good guys have enough money to reach that threshold and compete.
Yeah, and just because you've got a lot of people outside.
Yeah.
For anybody who wants to work on this, Citizen Action will be working on this. We'll be working on pressuring the governor. And why don't you put up the email address so that people can reach us?
In PowerPoint, it's going to be a little hard,
Oh,
but I mean,
here.
you can just, that's awesome.
I just am not legible.
Yeah, go for it. That's great. Did other people have questions while Tay writes contact
Can
info?
you read this?
I've got cards too. If people want them, I can give them. Yes, go ahead.
When you mentioned Verizon and its donations across the state, I'm not familiar with what's the structure of corporations and how they make those donations internally? Like who's the decision?
That's an interesting, actually Dan Squadron, and God bless him for not talking about this because he could have just talked about this at length because it's something he's really good on as well. But he knew this topic was supposed to be public financing. There's actually also really interesting potential to legislate what corporations have to do in order to decide to give contributions. Right now, there's basically no laws on it. In some states and at the federal level, corporations aren't allowed to donate directly. In some states like ours, they can donate as much as an individual can, and really a lot more. But that's probably the next level of trying to especially control the independent expenditures. If it's not constitutional to just ban independent expenditures, which it isn't, according to our Supreme Court, what we can do is pass laws that say corporations that want to give money to candidates have to go through a certain internal process. Maybe it has to be an open vote of their shareholders or whatever, which will at least reduce the frequency of corporations giving out these big checks. They'll only give checks to people that they think they can convince their shareholders are worthy of giving the checks to. That's going to be a lot fewer people, and so that would.
So right now, depending on however a corporation wants to do it, they figure out.
Yeah, and it's all about different corporations have their own internal rules, right? So some have tighter rules than others. There's no laws forcing them to have a certain system. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just thinking that the Supreme Court has actually seemed to be sympathetic to the idea of transparency. So is there a way to put pressure on corporations by making them more transparent?
If nothing else, if states or the federal government pass laws like what I was talking about, making corporations go through a certain process, it seems very likely that the Supreme Court would not strike that down, like they've struck some other stuff. That's it.
At least it becomes a public problem if they're...
Well, yeah, and at least we know that law would last, unlike some of these other systems. Yeah.
There's another way, which is through shareholder resolutions. And you come onto our Facebook page, because that's also being pursued.
Come on in. Yeah. So any other questions? And I think the next group's going to get started, so I don't want to slow them down. Thank you guys all. I've got cards if people want to be in touch or have follow-up questions. I'm happy to give them out.